This project didn't start with a tutorial. It started with an idea and a huge reference sheet with paintings, illustrations, color studies, and a question: how do I translate this into a painterly 3D animated shot? In this video, I'll break down how I combine hand-painted textures, geometry nodes, and a procedural workflow where I intentionally broke the rules. I'm trying something a little different with this project. Throughout this video, I'll explain my thought process using quick sketches and ideas first, before jumping into a more detailed Blender breakdown. At the end of every major section, I'll also show a quick render or snapshot of the relevant setup such as material nodes, geometry nodes, or textures, so you can pause, take a closer look if you want. This was a fun project overall. It let me combine a lot of things I enjoy: hand-painted textures, geometry node, and a more experimental, procedural workflow into a small animated showcase. It's been snowing a lot here in Ontario lately, and I really wanted to create an icy environment for my next project. While exploring a few ideas, I slowly landed on the concept of a looping animation, where a small spirit moves through an icy world in search of its destination. I imagined it traveling along a frozen river surrounded by birch trees. That immediately felt like a good opportunity to lean into geometry nodes for scattering and variation. For the spirit itself, I wanted something simple but expressive. A blue flame-like form with a subtle, pulsing motion. That part would be mostly driven by material animation. And finally, I wanted a strong atmospheric background, towering mountains and soft clouds to frame the scene and give it a sense of scale and depth. The way I approached this project was fairly straightforward, but with a small twist. Instead of moving the camera through the environment, I kept the camera static and placed everything on the surface of a sphere, which becomes our world. On either side of the camera's view, the environment is filled with trees and rocks generated using geometry nodes. The background elements sit further away to help with depth. By slowly rotating the sphere, we get the illusion of moving forward through a forest. The spirit itself is animated right in front of the camera, which helped reinforce a sense of motion. This setup also makes it much easier to create a clean looping animation. The first step is to add in painterly details to environment assets such as trees, rocks, etc. Alright, now let's jump into Blender. I started by modeling the birch trees. The base mesh is extremely simple, just a cylinder that I slowly shaped into a basic tree trunk. Most of the detail would come from texture painting, so I didn't spend much time on modeling. Painting, I use the paint system add-on, mainly because of how intuitive it is. It's a layer-based workflow that feels very similar to Photoshop, which makes experimentation much smoother. The base color is a simple white. On a new image layer, I started painting in the bark shapes following my reference images, focusing on irregular strokes rather than uniform patterns. My initial goal was to get a couple of trees ready so I could test the geometry node setup. So I quickly painted a second tree using the same approach. Once that was done, I moved on to geometry nodes, and I also painted the rocks as part of the same phase. Before jumping in, here's the basic idea behind my geometry node setup. I wanted to scatter meshes across the surface on its faces. Make sure they align to the surface normals. Control where different assets spawn, trees in some areas, rocks in others. So first, I created a sphere and positioned the camera along the surface, looking out toward the background. I later switched to an icosphere, though either works. Then, I created a new geometry node setup. The base nodes are distribute points on faces and instance on points. I brought in my tree collection and connected it to the instance node. To align the trees along the surface normal, I added an aligned rotation to vector node. I connected the normal output from the distribute points on faces into it and then into the instance rotation. To avoid everything looking too uniform, I added a rotate instance node, driven by a random value converted through a rotation to Euler setup. Since the sphere was relatively small compared to the tree scale, I adjusted the scale until it felt right. After some tweaking, I reached a stage that I was happy with. But the trees were way too dense. I only wanted them along a strip on either side of the river. Before refining that further, I quickly set up a simple world shader so I could better judge the lighting and contrast. I gave it a temporary blue sky and rotated the sun until I started getting shadows that helped define form. To control where the trees spawn, I selected the desired areas on the sphere and assigned them to a vertex group called trees. Back in geometry nodes, I added a named attribute node with this vertex group selected and connected it to the density factor input of the distribute points on faces. That instantly removed trees from the areas outside the vertex group. I tweaked the vertex group a bit more until the distribution felt balanced. Next, I moved on to scattering rocks. I created another vertex group called rocks, focused mainly on the river edges. The setup is very similar to trees. I started with a simple UV sphere as a placeholder. Once that was working, I modeled a few rock variations by sculpting basic shapes and texture painting over them. Again, very similar to how we created the trees. For the rock textures, I used a brown base, then gradually painted in snow towards the top, blending rock color and white as it rises. I spent some time adjusting the scale and density in geometry nodes until the rocks felt naturally placed. At this point, I needed to make sure that the trees and rocks didn't spawn on top of each other. After some research, I found a clean solution. I used a geometry proximity node connected to the rock distribute on faces nodes. That distance output goes into a less than math node. In the tree setup, I added a delete geometry node between the distribute points on faces and the instance on points. The result of the less than math node is connected to the delete section. After tweaking the distance values, I was really happy with the results. The trees and rocks now respect each other's space. Here's the final geometry node setup if you want to pause and take a look. With the base scattering done, I spent some time adding more rock variations and adjusting the scale randomness for visual interest. Next was a frozen river. I changed the base color to a deeper blue and also added a roughness layer. Keep the ice area slightly reflective. I then manually painted the fallen snow over the frozen river, blending the whole scene together. Once the color pass was done, I repeated the snow patterns in the roughness layer to create a glossy look in the ice and rough where the snow had landed. This step really helped bring this whole scene together. With the environment in place, I moved on to animating the spirit. I created a simple sphere and placed it in front of the camera. The movement itself was very simple, just a basic looping animation where it moves along the river. For the flame effect, I followed a stylized fire approach. I'll link the tutorial that inspired this in the description. Definitely worth checking out. This starts off by creating a flame shape over the spirit. Then added a displace modifier using a marble texture. Animate the noise by attaching the texture coordinates to an empty axis and moving it along the z-axis using the hash frame. Shading, I used two blue gradient textures as shown here mixed into an emission shader. Each of these have a color ramp to control the gradient. The following snippet is added to the factor of the mix shader node, which lets us control the inner and outer color of the flame. After this, I tweaked the colors to get a distinct ethereal blue flame. Next, I duplicated the shader and gave the inner sphere a red and pink color. I added some subtle shape key animation so the flame reacts slightly to the motion, which helps sell the illusion. For the background, I modeled simple mountain shapes and texture painted them using multiple layers to get a painterly look. The clouds were appended from a meditative cat project. I'll link that video if you're interested. I placed them around the mountains to enhance the scale and depth. I also added a bit of depth of field to help push the background further away. For the sky, I reused my stillness sky setup from this project. Link in the description if you want to take a look at it. I tweaked the colors until it matched the scene. At this point, I also removed the larger clouds since I liked it simpler as a gradient. I then animated the sky to transition smoothly from morning to sunset to night and back to morning, creating a seamless loop. Here I keyframe the sun rotation values to mimic the change in time caused by sky transitions in the shadows. For stars, I used a cluster of Voronoi texture and a color ramp in the world shader, and keyframe their visibility so they appear only at night. Here's the final world shader setup. To finish things off, I keyframed the cloud shaders so they also change color accordingly. I added more contrast to the trees and rocks. This would add some variety in the final render amongst all the snow. I also added falling snow using a simple particle emitter. You'll see tons of showcases online on how to do this. Make sure to vary the scale, rotation and motion to keep it organic. Finally, I added fog using a cube with the principal volume shader. Make sure to vary scale, rotation and motion to keep it organic. This really helps sell depth and atmosphere. And here are some small additions that I added. I attached a small point light to the spirit so its movement affects the environment with subtle light. I added some outlines to the trees and rocks with a solidify modifier and the following outline material. Finally, some more texture painting on the rocks. And yeah, that's it. This project was all about balancing procedural tools with hands-on experimentation, knowing when to let the system work and when to step in and paint over it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.